I'm grateful to Martin and Kevin for allowing me to be here, and very happy to talk with you in the context of the Open Access Conference. What I'm going to be talking about is not only open access, it's not purely open access. Government information, a big part of my topic, is kind of typically open, but as I hope to convince you that open access both helps and hinders that there are drawbacks for both with government information. Yesterday at the meeting of the Preserving Electronic Government Information Group, the PEGI group, we talked about the recent emergency mobilization of scientists, computer programmers, and librarians to preserve at-risk scientific and environmental data and documentation in the wake of the 2015 election. The Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, EDGI, and Data Refuge and other volunteer initiatives are now harvesting data sets and documentation from the websites of the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Energy, and other beleaguered agencies, fearing a purge of those data by the new Trump administration. That mobilization is an unprecedented event and attests to the power of citizen-based action. The fears that prompted this action are not unjustified. Important information and documentation has been disabled and or removed from federal agency websites in the past for a variety of reasons. In the wake of 9/11, a great deal of sensitive material was withdrawn from the Department of Energy and other government webs and government sites for national security reasons. More recently, the interface of the White House website that enabled search and analysis of the visitor logs quietly disappeared for other reasons. Grassroots actions will, like the EDGI and like the Data Refuge Project, will forestall the wholesale loss of data in the short run. But given the current administration's known aversion to transparency, withdrawal of public data could well become chronic and therefore require a long-term solution. The recent citizen efforts, though noble, are essentially workarounds, compensating for the fact that the apparatus established by our society to ensure public access to government information no longer squares with information realities. In the last half-century, the digital revolution and new political and economic forces have combined to fundamentally change the way in which information is produced, packaged, and disseminated. As a result, the institutions we rely upon to preserve the historical record, namely the libraries, archives, and museums, suddenly find themselves structurally unsuited to that task. This development has important consequences. Failure of the memory institutions threatens more than just the writing of history. The breakdown of society's memory-building capabilities will create a collective amnesia that undermines the accountability and the transparency essential to democracy. These developments threaten the ability of the courts, the independent media, and other institutions of civil society to establish the facts of critical matters, even in our own time. Today, two federal agencies historically responsible for the survival and accessibility of government records and information, the National Archives and Records Administration and the Government Publishing Office, have neither the necessary authority nor apparently the resources to fulfill their mission in the digital world. The Federal Records Act requires executive branch departments and agencies to maintain for future consultation the records of their activities. NARA is charged with preserving those records for the purpose of providing, quote, the administration, Congress, and the public with a history of public policy execution and its results. The Federal Records Act is clear about NARA's authority to prevent unlawful removal or destruction of records both in its own custody and in the hands of federal agencies. The Act reads, the head of each federal agency shall notify the Archivist of the United States of any actual, impending, or threatened unlawful removal, defacing, alteration, corruption, deletion, erasure, or other destruction of records in the custody of the agency, and with the assistance of the archivist shall initiate action through the Attorney General for the recovery of records the head of the federal agency knows or has reasons to believe have been unlawfully removed from that agency. That's from the Federal Records Act, unquote. Unfortunately, lawful removal can cover a lot of sins, and the authorization was written for a world where paper was the primary medium of federal communications and record keeping. Time-tested archive protocols are built around the life cycle of analog records. providing for the orderly retirement, review, declassification, and weeding of tangible materials filed in drawers and document boxes. Those protocols are hard to apply to the dynamic digital objects that live in networked web environments or reside in cloud-based systems. With no effective apparatus in place to deal effectively with the scale and technical complexity of government records being produced today by agencies like the National Security. With no effective apparatus in place to deal with the scale and technical complexity of government records being produced today by agencies like the NSA, and on the screen is the National Security Archives, or National Security Agency's Bumblehive data center built in the Utah desert, one of multiple data centers built by the NSA to manage the data derived from NSA activities. Government information and records will always be in danger of disappearance at the discretion of agency personnel. The revelations of the Hillary Clinton email investigation demonstrate how much that discretion can be stretched. GPO, for its part, is charged with providing free, ready, and permanent public access to federal government information now and for future generations, unquote. The Federal Depository Library Program, a public-private partnership, helped fulfill that mission throughout the paper era. That program comprised a nationwide network of libraries serving as repositories and service centers. Guided by a published catalog of federal documents, citizens could find in those repositories much of the information produced by their government. Unfortunately, the program offers little defense today against the arbitrary removal of materials from public view in the digital age. The lack of even an inventory of agency websites and data sets has tremendously complicated the work of the data refuge and data rescue projects. Systematic efforts have been made to minimize the periodic loss. Periodic efforts have been made to minimize the loss of web-based documentation of government agency activities with the turnover of administrations. In recent years, NARA enlisted the Internet Archive to undertake end-of-term harvests of executive branch agency websites to preserve snapshots of those sites on the eve of a regime change. However, those harvests did not prevent the loss of important government information within the term of the administrations. It's widely known that sensitive materials were removed, as I said, from DOE and other government websites in the wake of 9/11 for reasons of national security. But aside from national security, there are other factors that have resulted in losses as well. One example, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, for example, during its 2002-2003 Western Energy Markets investigation in the wake of the Enron scandal, posted to the web millions of pages of in-house Enron emails, scanned documents, and other materials discovered in the course of the investigation, as well as transcripts of depositions taken in the course of related prosecutions. The massive trove of documents was hosted in a database using proprietary Xera document document repository platform. The Xera repository software was hosted by an organization named CACI, a publicly traded Arlington, Virginia-based company that, quotes, provides information solutions and services for intelligence, defense, and federal civilian customers, unquote. Among other things, CACI is also known for its role in identifying and hiring the intelligence analysts and interrogators at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. After protests by the Enron executives that the documents included on the site included personal information caught up in the investigation's net, that repository was taken offline. This is what you see on the screen when you click the link on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's website. Fortunately, some of those emails and documents were preserved and rehosted by programmers at MIT and by others. At the same time, the web's enabled new avenues of access to government information and has empowered new actors to expose government records. WikiLeaks and other platforms were instrumental in exposing sensitive Department of Defense, unauthorized exposing of sensitive Department of Defense Iraq War documents. And the Document Cloud platform maintained by the Investigative Reporters and Editors Consortium enabled journalists to access and mine millions of pages from the Panama Papers documents. these kinds of workarounds are compensating for either classification or withholding of, on basis of sensitivity of government-produced information. It's telling, though, that that all these efforts and the recent flurry of citizen data rescue activity, amid this flurry of activity, NARA and GPO have largely been relegated to the sidelines. This is only the latest of many indications that existing preservation policies and the technology apparatus we have in place to carry out those policies are fundamentally flawed and need to be retooled. Rethinking and redefining the respective responsibility of NARA and GPO in the digital realm could be done in the context, of updating the charters of the two organizations, for example, and the Federal Records Act, distinguishing between records, which is NARA's purview, and documents, GPO's purview, made sense in the print era, but the web and social media environments have since blurred that distinction. Granting the two agencies greater authority over agency publishing and records management would be a major step towards eliminating a range of abuses on the part of the agencies, and from suppression of climate data to the deletion of certain State Department emails. An even greater challenge will be putting more robust technical capabilities in place at NARA and GPO. NARA is expected to accommodate the records of a wide variety of federal agencies. However, the growth of the federal government since the 1960s and the digital revolution have created an explosion in the volume and content, the volume of content produced by those agencies, and the data holdings of NSAs, of entities as different as NASA and NSA alone, those two agencies alone dwarf NARA's current processing capabilities. Add to sheer size the variety and technical complexity of digital media and enabling applications, many of which are proprietary, and the velocity at which information is now consumed and exchanged, and our apparatus for preserving the past looks pretty undersized for the task. It's not clear to what extent technologies actually put in place, and moreover by NARA and GPO in recent years, are equal to the challenge of digital records and data. But the evidence is not terribly encouraging. Since the 1990s, NARA has invested substantially to develop the Electronic Records Archives, a system intended to safeguard, quote, safeguard and preserve the records of our government, ensure that the people can discover, use, and learn from the documentary heritage, and ensure continuing access to the essential documentation of the rights of American citizens and the actions of their governments. That's from NARA's mission statement. As a use case for the system that is spot on, that description of what the Electronic Records Archives does is spot on. But what has actually been delivered after considerable investment does not appear to be up to the challenge. At this stage, the Electronic Records Archives, the ERA, has yet to evince an ability to expose to public view anything other than scans of paper documents, photos and simple cable and email messages, cable and email messages. The complex geospatial data and databases held by federal agencies will be a better test of the system, but that test is yet to come. The GPO, for its part, invested heavily to develop FedSys, purported to be a world-class system for managing official government content. FedSys, GPO claims, will verify and track versions, assure authenticity, preserve content, and provide permanent public access to government content. Yet it is clear to any user that FedSys is also underscaled to cope with the volume and variety of government-issued data, and that no regular pipeline for populating the system has been put in place. The situation is no better at peer public institutions abroad, at the National Archives UK and at the Library and Archives Canada. Hardly the fault of NARA and GPO themselves, these developments, I think, are symptomatic of a general erosion of the effectiveness of our traditional memory organizations. Indeed, the fabric of our society's memory seems to be fraying, if not unraveling. Ironically, in an era of information abundance, when events are over-documented to an unprecedented degree, technology and political and economic forces threaten to render the apparatus created to preserve a lasting record of events inoperative, and to sweep away our ability to render an enduring record of our time for future generations. This is a threat not only to historians and to generations in the future, but to the transparency and accountability of key actors in our society, like governments, organizations, corporations, key actors critical to democratic society. What can we in the library sector do in the face of these issues? Right? The Library and Archives Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police are some of the earliest adopters of police body cameras, and the video footage captured by those cameras are not being preserved at all in the government, within the government sector. They're being preserved by commercial digital video repository organizations, chief among which is Taser International. So, as a library, what can we in the library sector do? At an April 2000 forum organized by the Center for Research Libraries, Leviathan, Libraries and Government Information in the Age of Big Data, 5 broad strategies emerged. I believe that together those strategies constitute a realistic action agenda for research libraries that can provide a new playbook for effective stewardship of government information on behalf of our researcher constituents. The first strategy, triage. Given the scarcity of the resources available for preservation per se today, it's really imperative that research libraries focus their efforts on what is truly at risk and what is not likely to be adequately preserved by other actors in the public sector or in the private sector. Digital materials produced by key agencies of distressed U.S. states and unstable foreign governments, for example, are at great risk. Even greater risk than materials produced by national governments of developed nations. The second, drill down. We have to determine what is at risk, and determining that requires a full understanding of the digital government information life cycle and supply chain. Such an understanding depends upon detailed information on critical archiving infrastructures created for the purpose of preserving government information. It depends on accessibility of detailed information on the cloud services upon which agencies depend, and on the proprietary systems and platforms that agencies are adopting to distribute information and share information. Libraries can play an important role, I think, in promoting systems analysis and application literacy, which I think will be critical to citizenship, more critical than in the past. Third, researchers in different fields require different things of government information. Integrity and authenticity of data mean one thing to an economist and another to a historian. To serve constituencies using new analytical tools tailored to their respective disciplines, like text and data mining and those kinds of applications, libraries will have to abandon the one-size-fits-all regimes that we've used to accommodate our constituencies during the print era. Research libraries must actively engage as a community with key suppliers of government information, including NARA, GPO, and Library and Archives Canada, and must unite to gain leverage in dealings with key aggregators like ProQuest, Bloomberg Law, Economist.com, Hein, and others. Given the scale of resources behind those suppliers, libraries can achieve scale by speaking with one voice and negotiating not only favorable terms of access to government information databases, but also provisions for long-term accessibility and integrity, quality of metadata, interoperability, and tools for analysis and mining of text and data. Fifth, act up. To gain the resources and standing necessary to play a meaningful role in a realm as large as government information, libraries will have to forge new alliances. Organizations now abound that share library interest in public access to government information and in documentation. They should be enlisted in the independent advocacy on behalf of NARA and GPO for more resources and for building of new capabilities and more authority. The National Security Archive, for example, uses FOIA requests, litigation, and other means to compel the U.S. government to declassify and disclose records and information. Though it's not a library, the National Security Archive and other transparency organizations are successfully making a wealth of critical historical evidence and data available to scholars and citizens alike. Those are the points of the agenda that came, the research library's agenda that came out of the Leviathan project. If one defines preservation as protecting and empowering access for our constituencies, then archiving becomes only one of several appropriate strategies. Under certain circumstances, stewardship will continue to involve libraries and archives taking, as I did in the paper era, wholesale custody of materials produced by governments. But in the digital environment, the custodial or depository approach has become much less effective. Ergo, the very 5-point agenda looks very different than what we've done in the past. But as public institutions rooted in communities that value facts over spin, NARA, GPO, and research and academic libraries are the natural and appropriate custodians of public data. Third-party repositories of government records and data, like those created by the Data Rescue Projects and WikiLeaks, Document Cloud, ProQuest, and others, fulfill an important function, but they're neither intended nor designed for longevity. The inherent transparency and accountability that public agencies like NARA and GPO bring to government and that research libraries bring to the nonprofit research sector are public goods that are essential to democratic society. It would be a mistake to write those institutions off as no longer relevant in the digital era. The danger we face is not just the loss of important scientific data, but the irreversible tilting of the information landscape in favor of the powerful and the privileged, rather than the general public good. Thank you. I think there's time for questions and comments. I think is that right?
Yes,
yeah.
We've got quite a bit actually.
Thanks.
Crucial. If I could get a copy of it, I would love it. Let me start with that. I thought some of your comments were kind of interesting because I thought there were things in there that I considered, there were public information that I would not consider valuable for collecting. So the police body camera sort of surprised me because to me that represents as much risk in terms of if somebody calls the police on me and there's a body camera and maybe I'm drunk, but I'm not committing a crime, it's not my best look, but now it's a matter of public record, that concerns me. I mean, really when police go and do something, I understand for accountability for their work, that makes sense, but beyond that, there's some risk to the public. And so it was interesting you brought that up, and there are other things in there, like, when some things come down, I find it tough to determine where the legitimate line is for keeping it private, national security, things like that, and where it is important for us to have these records and this information for the public good, for our understanding of history, for knowing how policy is decided.
The police body camera, that information, the video feed or video captured on police body cameras, you're right, is inflammatory, potentially inflammatory. It's got serious privacy implications in the fact that police are collecting this data now. There is a discussion going on about what of those hours and hours of footage produced by each police officer every day, about how much of that to keep, how much of it should be kept. Should they keep only what's recorded in relation to a crime, and should they then also, or should they only keep what's recorded in relation to a crime that actually goes to court? Should they, after the court proceedings happen, or if it's a crime, should they keep it for as long as the statute of limitations on the crime, that kind of thing? And so these are questions that are still nobody has the answer to these, or they're being discussed, people are trying to figure them out. But what's important is to know how the government is going to make those decisions, what they're going to base that on. And I think this is where it's not just disappearance of data that's a problem, with government records and government information is a problem. It's also the survival of them in some cases a problem. I mean, there's survival of footage of somebody who hasn't been, if you haven't gotten to the tanning salon that day and you're picked up, on police camera, then, why should the government have that? And that's all got to be worked out. And also where custody of those is. The reason I showed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was we did an evaluation of Library and Archives Canada. CRL did an audit, or an advisory audit of Library and Archives Canada's ability to preserve government records, particularly video. And the capability was just not there. I mean, digital video is just not there. And so we don't know this. I mean, we're now, what, 20 years into the digital age, 30 years into the digital age, and a lot of this stuff has either not been figured out, or if it's been figured out, we're not sure why or how it's been figured out. But yeah, but no, that's hugely problematic. Yes.
Yeah, seeing the picture of the NSA
Bumble Hive.
Yeah, in Utah, was it? Nevada?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think about one carefully placed bomb and how much information has gone, like that. What are we doing to protect it from even, the digital risk of virus, of bit rot, of obsolescence, of whatever. Let alone a cyber attack or a physical attack.
Yeah. The question was about the Utah NSA data center. What kinds of protections are being put in place that prevent loss through either sabotage or through natural deterioration of digital media? It's not clear. With an organization like NSA, you're probably not going to know because if you know, the hackers know. And but there is this problem of transparency. I mean, classified information and secret information is very, very difficult to. I mean, just when and how you get that out to the public eventually is a very difficult thing to decide. And there are protocols in place for print era, paper era documentation, certain number of years after, and then there's certain criteria for declassification. But for the digital stuff, there's really, it's hard to say what the criteria are, and so I think just transparency, more transparency about what is being done by the federal agencies themselves, like NSA, to the extent that you can, and then what's being done, what can be done by NASA or by NARA. To take those things over. The enormous amount of government-produced geospatial data that collected by the U.S. created by the U.S. Geological Survey from the Landsat satellites, and that is largely managed on a proprietary ESRI platform. And this proprietary platform, the ArcGIS platform, has been adopted by governments all over the world for the management of their geospatial data. The fact that it's a proprietary platform creates a certain risk in the long term. If the company goes out of business or if the code, gets, but so there are certain contingencies now built into government records and government record keeping because of the adoption of digital records or electronic records that really haven't been worked out very well. U.S. Geological Survey has always had a hard time getting their records, retiring their records into National Archives and Records Administration, even in the paper era, the volume of them, complexity of them. But with digital and with the combination of a proprietary platform, that's even more tricky. Yes.
I'm interested in hearing you talk a little bit more about the collectivization or collectivized part of your platform. In North Carolina, we have the smaller schools are able to come together, but the research ones to do their own thing. It's hard to get them to work with this. And so, what do you see as the vision for helping that process actually happen?
Oh, the question is more about collectivization. Can I say more about collectivization and what I see on that? I think there have to be more national site licenses for critical data, particularly government documents, government information, even if those don't require payment and monetary compensation. But we have engaged, CRL has engaged. CRL got into licensing of databases about 10 years ago, and we came late to the game. We were different than the other consortia. The only reason we got into it is because we felt that there was a need to be able to engage and influence the large aggregators like ProQuest, Gale, and Factiva, LexisNexis, to behave in ways that are conducive to supporting academic research long term, namely to preserve materials for the longer term. And we've been able to negotiate national terms for all U.S. libraries, in many cases all U.S. and Canadian libraries, for access to certain critical data sets and critical databases. This has been slow going because we're dealing with providers that normally don't deal with libraries, that normally deal with either the financial sector or the business sector or the legal sector or the national security sector. So these are organizations that that sell repackaged government information, organizations like Eastview Information Service and ProQuest. And they, the terms on which they provide access to these things for don't really match academic research libraries' interests. There's not enough emphasis on longevity. There's not archiving. Neither ProQuest nor Eastview Information Services are archiving with Portico or clocks. And so our role is, what we've done is actually pushed ProQuest to explore in depth the cost of archiving their big databases with clocks and Portico, and they've recently came to the conclusion that it would be prohibitively costly to do that and technically impossible, and that they are now exploring. In fact, they've now arrived at a new solution, which they're going to be announcing at ALA next year. But that was largely because we've been pushing them on it. We negotiate terms for access to ProQuest databases on a large scale. We're also interested in outside of the area of government information in the larger providers of critical information for research and for society. We have negotiated the academic site license, national academic site license for the NewYorkTimes.com, which gives us some leverage in influencing the New York Times to archive and to make available in a better form its back files and the enormous amount of content that's being published by the Times online only. What people get from the ProQuest database is basically the print edition, and what that increasingly, the New York Times is increasing their content is online. And so there are issues with that, but part of it, the purpose of it is access, but another part is preservation. A certain amount of the content that New York Times publishes online is licensed by the New York Times from third-party providers like Associated Press and Getty Images for the short term, not for the long term. And we're in negotiations with the Times about extending the term of their license, the duration of the license on those, so those materials get. So I don't know, does that answer the question? Thanks. Martin.
A comment and then a question. I don't think there could be a better underscoring of the vulnerability of public data than the current ongoing world attacks, the WannaCry virus that's hitting many other countries, and the public hospital and other sort of infrastructural data in many of these places. My question is, so CRL has historically been a great resource for research libraries of hard to find microfilm, newspaper collections, many research materials that are very rare and hard to get for even major research libraries. What's the strategy, or what is your thinking going forward at CRL about the kinds of data treasure troves that you might acquire and provide access to research libraries, and how are you thinking about that going forward?
Well, licensing is one side of it, negotiating at the national level for licenses. The other side is promoting transparency of what's actually going on. We have a 165,000 square foot building, but it's not going to hold the collective output of the government agencies whose print output we've been collecting, or microform output we've been collecting. So our point too has been that it's, aside from building the shared collection, which was a good strategy for the print era, supporting the local decision making about investment in electronic resources and and digital capabilities is something that we've been doing. So we've done, in the past 2 years, we've done about 12 webinars on topics like text and data mining, which had to do with getting electronic rights for text and data mining in vendor contracts and from providers, what people are doing with text and data mining, how scholars are using it, what tools they're using, that kind of thing. On the licensing of geospatial data locally by libraries, the problems that libraries are having with non-library people doing direct acquisition or direct purchase of GIS data sets from vendors, and then the problems the challenges that creates for the other users in the same community, at the same university, even in the same department, even on the same team in some cases. We are advocating, we're pushing very hard for libraries to be part of that, to be in the loop for those kinds of licensing transactions. And so that's been a matter of getting information out there, creating venues for sharing information about the challenges of these kinds of things. So those have been important things as well. So, all the way down the end.
Good morning. Thank you for the keynote. I was another presentation last week, and then there was a presentation about Internet Archive. There is any partnership or people from Internet Archive and the CRL group because they have been archiving government pages, even Twitters and blogs and things like that. And there is any view there is any interaction?
Yeah, the question was about, is there any interaction or any partnership between us and the CRL, I guess, and the Internet Archive or research libraries in the Internet Archive. Internet Archive has become an important service provider for a lot of libraries, including the Library of Congress and the British Library, for harvesting and archiving content from the web. We have found, though, that there are certain problems with what the Internet Archive is doing. The data sets that they're creating are quite flawed. There are broken links. There are links to asynchronous resources that in the archived websites. We did an analysis of their Internet Archive's harvests of the NewYorkTimes.com, and we published that on our website. And the harvest we found was sporadic, but also problematic in that a lot of the content was gone. The crawler couldn't really get all the content. Also, the rate at which the NewYorkTimes.com website changed during the course of a single Internet Archive crawl meant that some of the pages were from today, some of the pages captured were from today, some of the pages captured were from 2 weeks from now. And so there was it's a very problematic data set that they're creating. The other thing too is it's my strong feeling that libraries are accountable to the communities that support them. And that's why they're such important institutions in society, that a lot of your libraries are accountable to the academic community, to the interests of researchers and students and educators on your campus. The Library of Congress and the British Library are accountable to the American people and and directly accountable to the American people and to the UK citizenry. The Internet Archive is run by an individual with a board of 4 people, none of whom are connected to the academic community or the general citizen in general. I think that what they're doing is very important as a service provider, and a lot of content they have is very useful, but I think there are real problems with the sustaining of that operation. And I think you have to think of the Internet Archive as a private collection in the way museums think about private collectors. I mean, these are people who have their own priorities. They're not accountable to the larger community, whereas libraries are. And so I think what the Internet Archives are doing was done by a real library with some accountability to the community. I think the results would probably be better. So. Also, I think one other thing is that a lot of what has undermined a lot of our efforts in digital preservation is we're wedded to the preservation template that preservation is going out and getting something and bringing it in to within the perimeter of the institution, to capturing it and rehosting it in technical terms. That's not doable in an age where the largest sources of information are Facebook, Google, Amazon. It's just not going to happen. You know, the Library of Congress's recent experience with trying to archive the Twitter feed, they announced a great fanfare several years ago they were going to archive the whole Twitterverse. And then just very quietly about a year ago said, well, we can't really. We're finding out that we can't really. And what they found out was that pulling that Twitter out of its native environment, namely the proprietary platform that Twitter owns and operates, deadens it. I mean, it's like taking a plant out of soil. And what you get is a mass of text data that has, and text and a very limited amount of metadata, because Twitter's metadata is mostly proprietary, that doesn't enable you to do the kinds of things with Twitter content that people want to do. On the other hand, Twitter has developed amazing tools for people to mine the Twitterverse. And people are doing all kinds of analysis using APIs that Twitter has developed. And same with the New York Times. Mining New York Times content, the best mining of that is done by using the APIs that New York Times created and is putting online. So not only the content, but the tools are going to be better off right where they are. But libraries, what we have to do is get influence with those organizations enough to help to influence them to make the right decisions about how to keep this stuff for the long run. With Facebook, the bias that was kind of structural bias that they were accused of in their deciding what political posts to send to what Facebook pages, what user pages, was very non-transparent. But once it became known, once somebody detected that this thing was not operating well, then then Facebook kind of coughed up the information about, yeah, well, this is what we do. We have, algorithms doing it, and now we'll have people doing it, and that kind of thing. And that kind of transparency and advocacy ought to be done by libraries, it seems to me. I mean, we should really be monitoring the big data holders, the big content holders, and digging up for better information about how they work, because how they work has a consequence is going to be consequential for the long-term integrity of the records and the data that they produce or that they hold. So, did that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah. Probably more than you wanted to hear. Sorry, I've had 2 cups of coffee this morning. Yes.
So you had mentioned that NARA needs to change its charter in order to keep up with the times. Are you involved in that, and what are the proposals?
No, but I think there needs to be some citizen action on this. NARA is really hampered by the limitations of their charter. Their charter was written in a time, I think it was the 1930s, when everything was paper. It was even before, the CIA was one of the earliest adopters of electronic communications through their cable systems, and NARA even, their charter predates that. And there have been attempts recently to update the Federal Records Act, but they don't really get it. They don't seem to really understand how digital records work. NARA doesn't have any way of preventing the agencies, for instance, from adopting a fly-by-night social media application for their main communications. And so you can wind up getting stuff locked in proprietary media. They didn't have the ability to really, they knew that Hillary Clinton her State Department emails was not being run through the State Department.gov or the State Department servers, but they couldn't do anything about it. They didn't have the authority to do anything about it. And I think that's a problem. I think that the records managers of the agencies, it may be better if they work for the Inspector General of the agencies rather than just the agencies themselves. I mean, those kinds of changes could happen that could really strengthen NARA's hand. And second of all, they don't have the resources they need to do what they have to do to take in the kinds of agency materials that they need to. One thing that NARA has been talking about is the data at rest concept, which is the idea or the possibility of the agencies managing their own records for the long term and just designating certain records as permanent and making the agencies themselves making sure under NARA's advice how to maintain those for the longer term. But the question then comes up, well, then does that mean that the Census Bureau publishes those records in the long run, all that stuff for research or not? So, yeah. Did that answer your question?
I
Not
think
really.
So I was trying to find the charter, but I did find the mission about, we drive openness, cultivate public participation, and strengthen our nation's democracy through public access to high-value government records. So kind of getting to that point about the body cams and stuff, I'm comfortable with their mission because the high-value public records versus like everything under the sun, including Hillary Clinton's emails about Chelsea going to school or whatever, and the body cam data, that's not, I don't want to see mission creep to everything. And I guess I'm concerned about when I hear weekends and all these emails that everything must be preserved by this high-value government.
That's a concern. The concern is about NARA becoming 1984, Big Brother. And so I think that, there are ways that can be prevented. I mean, NARA needs to have more authority, but not total authority. I think and I think they do. I mean, they work with the national security the agencies to determine how and what should be declassified and how and when on that. And so they'll never be totally independent. But on the matter of platforms for record keeping adopted and that kind of thing, they really need to have some power on that, it seems to me.
Putting them under the Inspector General just kind of scares me a bit. I don't know.
Does it?
I don't know. I just wondered what your specific idea from your organization's perspective would be to change that mission and to change that. What the specific wording would be, because I think this is okay.
Oh, well, the mission's fine. I mean, the mission statement's fine. I mean, it just was written last year, too. So it says, but what statutory authority do they have is different than that. I mean, I think their statutory authority just applies to records in their custody.
Yeah, they do say in their.
Yeah, and that's.
So what they're putting in their custody.
Yeah, or whatever anybody wants to give us. So essentially, and so that's not that great. Yes.
Speaking to that, with NARA, if you concentrate, it seems like we're spread very thin, that everybody's trying to do bits and pieces, and that there's a certain tension between concentrating all our efforts and focusing, okay, so we need to do this, and not everybody needs to do it, but if we have one person or one organization doing this, and yet should that organization come under threat, then you've lost it all and it's not repeated elsewhere. You don't have many copies, many places. And so there seems a little, tension between how do you make the best use of the resources out there collectively, and then how do you, I work for NARA. I know they aren't even keeping care of, they don't have the money to do the current mission they have now. You defund one organization and then they're totally hampered in their role. So how do you deal with that?
Well, it's a good question. The single point of failure, or single potential point of failure. I don't know. It's NARA's it for government records, and I think they have to be. I think as you say, they don't have the resources they need, and they should have the resources they need. And how do we convince the federal government to give them the resources they need? I think we have to speak. A lot of us work for academic. We have to speak on behalf of the researchers, or the academic research world. And I think there are certain things the academic research world needs from NARA that it may not get if things don't change. And so I think, our being able to speak collectively on NARA's behalf and independently of NARA, we're not just we can't be just, this is one of the things we talked about yesterday at the PEGI meeting, the Preserving Electronic Government Information meeting, was that it helps if outside organizations go independently and say to the Congress people or the legislators that there needs to be better, there needs to be more resources given, or this is what we need from NARA, and this is what NARA needs to be able to provide this kind of support for the research that's being done now. So, I mean, the transparency organizations are focusing on government records that are basically controversial, and so that's only a small portion of it. So the stuff that's germane and of consequence to people living right now, we're acting on behalf of people that will be around 20, 50, 60 years from now.